recording. You'll see a little screen. Okay, it's recording. And I'm going to go back and share my screen here from beginning. Oh, I said from beginning, I didn't go back to it. So this workshop is sponsored by DuPage County Stormwater Management. The title of it is Native Vegetation for Streambank Stabilization. Our speaker is Ryan Altop with NCAP Incorporated. DuPage County Stormwater Management was established in 1989, and they manage all stormwater issues in the county and enforce the countywide stormwater management and floodplain ordinance. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn this presentation over to Ryan. So Ryan, as I mentioned, Ryan Altop is with NCAP Incorporated. He is the Field Operations Director, Corporate Safety Director at NCAP. The presentation, Native Vegetation for Streambank Stabilization. He will be discussing the uses of native vegetation in the stabilization of stream banks, their limits, and things to consider in choosing the correct best management practice. With that, Ryan, it's all yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started here, and we'll jump right into it. We're going to talk a little bit about today about stream bank stabilization with native vegetation and the things you need to consider while doing so. So why do we need to stabilize our stream banks? There's a number of reasons. It kind of depends on your site and situation. You know, if you're working in an urbanized area, if you're working in a forest preserve, park, if you're working in, you know, a residential situation, commercial situation, it all kind of depends on why you would need to stabilize your stream. Are we protecting a structure? You know, if you're protecting, say, for instance, a canoe launch, like is at the bottom of this trail right here in the river, or this river in Indiana, are we maintaining a current stream bed height? Do we have multiple structures that are linked together, say underpasses underneath of a bridge, that we need to maintain the current bed height to prevent loss of the functionality of those structures? Are we preventing soil loss? So like again, in the instance of this canoe launch, are we trying to prevent that from being sedimented in? Are we trying to not lose a bank, you know, on somebody's property? Are we trying to maintain the footprint? So we have, say, for instance, a set channel width that could be in an urbanized stream that if the creek is really outside of that footprint, it's in somebody's backyard or in someone's foundation or in their home. Are we restoring an impact? Did we have to run a natural gas pipeline through the area and we need to restore the stream back to its original condition? Typically those are bored through these days, but possible impact. Or a railroad crash or something of that nature, and then we need to restore the stream back to its original habitat. Are we protecting habitat? Is there a high value species in the area, or you know, say a mussel or a turtle or something of that nature that we need to protect in the area? Or are we trying to create habitat for one of those things? So there's a bunch of different reasons why we might need to do some stream bank stabilization. And so, you know, then we're going to have our planning and design considerations. Is using native vegetation even a possibility? You know, in the instance of the photo on the right there, you know, almost have to use stone due to the drop in elevation from top to bottom. Would, you know, and the flow rates. Are additional practices needed for either establishment, native vegetation, or are there alternative stabilization practices necessary? You know, so how can we team the native vegetation up with other practices to make them work and function for us? You know, can we use the existing channel morphology, or do we have to create new channel morphology? And we can figure that all out through, you know, the field conditions modeling, flow rate and design cross sections, running the calculations. and kind of looking at what our actual overall goals are for the project. Are we looking to have a wooded stream bank, like you see below? And so maybe dense vegetation is not a possibility on the stream. Are we, looking for an open prairie type stream corridor? So that these are all things we have to take into consideration. Why would we even choose native vegetation in the first place? What are some reasons why, we might want to work with native vegetation over having, say, a manicured turf grass stream bank? So of course we've got the deep fibrous roots. Everybody's seen the um, pictograph down on the bottom right there, where the roots can extend down 6, 8, 12 feet, into the stream bank. And that's a big reason why we choose native vegetation. It doesn't require irrigation, which on a stream bank isn't always a big thing, but when you've got some stream banks that are tall and steep, especially in some of the urban environments where we can't lay a stream bank back, it's something to consider, is that not all native vegetation requires any type of irrigation at all. It's meant for being in the habitat that we live in. It's designed to be in the Midwest. It requires the right amount of water that already exists here. And we may see that change as climate change rolls through, and the climate changes a little bit. The native plants that actually are native here might actually change naturally over time. They give better filtration and infiltration. So the water that's running off of the areas around us and into that creek, which of course many of our creeks and rivers in the area are our sources for our drinking water. You're going to get better filtration and better infiltration back into that watershed because of the native vegetation. It's a diverse habitat, so there's many different things that can live within that stream bank off that native vegetation, and it's suitable for our local soil types. You're not trying to guess as to whether or not it's going to survive in the soil types that already exist here. The fluvial soils that already exist. We already kind of know what plants will survive that are native here. So that would be a huge reason why we would choose native vegetation. And of course, there's species selection. We already kind of talked, there's different areas within a creek corridor, but we already kind of talked that you're going to want to choose based on that sunlight and what we've got going on. If we've got a fully wooded stream bank, you may not want to select something that's going to require full sun all the time. If we have a very large floodplain in a forest or in a stream, you're not going to want to select plants that have to be in an upland setting all the time to survive, because in a floodplain they're going to experience occasional flooding and be in and around and underwater from time to time. So we want to select different plants as we go up that bank profile and back into the upland. So if we've got a very large emergent shelf, we want to make sure we've got plenty of plants selected for that area. If we've got a seep that comes into the creek or river along the edge, we want to make sure we've got proper and appropriate plants for that, and continue to design as we go down through our project. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit here about some best management practices that you can use and with native vegetation. Some of them are standalone. Some of them are incorporating native vegetation into those things, into those other BMPs, and how that would improve those BMPs. And then we'll also talk a little bit about woody vegetation and how those native species can be used to improve our stream banks and their stabilization as well. So native vegetation from seed, huge benefit for native vegetation from seed is the cost. You can also choose a larger diversity of species by using native vegetation, as opposed to, say, plant plugs, which only so many species are grown. And availability is another big thing, so later in the growing season, if you've got a project that's just coming online, sometimes those native plant plugs are hard to find. You may have to give a larger lead time to get native plant plugs sourced for your project. Whereas with seed, oftentimes it's just a matter of a phone call and maybe 1 or 2 seed substitutions on a 20 or 30 species mix, and you've got your seed. A day for delivery is about all it takes. Like I said, there's a lot more options, and you can vary those options up and down the stream channel, like we had just talked about, where you can start at the emergent zone and work your way back up and choose different seed mixes for each area. Possible drawbacks: seeds likely in a stream bank situation are going to require an additional BMP to get you through that interim growing state. You're probably going to have to put a temporary cover crop in with it, which if you pick the wrong temporary cover crop species, you might have to fight that back out of there. A lot of times we like to choose seed oats if possible with our mixes, just because they come up fast. They don't look a lot like any of the other native species, and you typically only last 1 season. There's not a big fight to try and get them back out of your natural area. Establishment time is another big thing with native seed. So you're going to have 3 years of needed maintenance to get you to your end game at a minimum, to get a completely fully established natural area. Typically, most of our stream banks, we're going to be regrading the area, like you see in the photo on the right there. So we're going to have, different slope heights and steepnesses to deal with our native vegetation there. And so, you may want to pick different species based on that as well. Invasive species management. So obviously we're going to have to do a lot of invasive species management with a seeded stream bank. There's always going to be new species carried in by the creek and river, and waterfowl and whatnot that fly in and out of the area. It will continue to get reseeded by the natural action of the seed just floating down the river or the creek or stream, and into your area. So something to take into account when choosing to start with seed, but it is definitely one of the best options we use regularly. And it can be easily combined with the other BMPs, which we'll talk about here in another minute or two. So native plant plugs, great option. Gets you a little bit of instant satisfaction. It's one of the few things that will stand up in that emergent zone over and over and over again. Obviously with creeks and rivers and streams, the water level changes, it bounces up and down. And so those emergent plant plugs have a little bit better chance of surviving versus brand new seedlings without any established root at all. You can choose exact species location. So if you've got a spot on your creek project or your river project that's very visible or requires some extra special attention, like you've got a level spreader flowing into your creek or something like that, it's a great spot to employ those plant plugs. Disadvantages, sometimes if you're higher up in the water column, you may have to actually irrigate or water those plant plugs. They're definitely more expensive than doing seed, as much as 10 to 1 cost almost, per acre of what you would pay for, or if not more, of what you would pay for doing seed in the same exact area. And there's big predation concerns, both in the stream situation, especially in rivers. You'll have carp issues where carp will come up and spawn along the shallows of the creek or river, and will not necessarily be trying to eat your plugs, but will destroy them by just the motion of their tail and the force that they put into their spawning activities. You'll also have things like muskrats, geese, ducks, and the likes trying to make tasty salads out of your out of your plant plugs, and you'll have to do things like put up enclosures like you see in the photo above, or the photo in the background here, where you've got to keep them out of there basically. And there's a number of ways to do that. You can do it with chicken wire on the outside edges. You can stick with just twine over twine. You're definitely going to have to put in, some type of flight or aviary protection across the top. So native plant plugs are another great option. These two can also be worked into a lot of the BMPs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. So vegetative plant mats, this is one that is not fantastic for everywhere, but the places it's great in, say in a low flow stream channel, or in areas that you're gonna need a lot of erosion protection right out of the box and really need to be getting ahead of the game, basically, getting a jump start on it, they're fantastic in. We did a channel a couple years back for Lake County Forest Preserve District, and they worked out fantastically. One of the kickers to that is it has to be watered a lot. Think like watering sod to get them established and out of the mat, basically. They need quite a bit of water. Thankfully, in rivers and streams, water is usually pretty readily accessible. So that emergent zone with the vegetative plant mats works out fantastically. Like I said, they have a super large root system already in place. They're typically grown in like a coir mat or something of that nature, so you can literally just staple them in to the shoreline and you've got instant vegetation. It's definitely instant vegetation that requires some heavy maintenance up front. But that being said, if done correctly, it can give you a big jump start to a project and possibly even get you almost a full year ahead of schedule almost. Cost, it is a rather expensive thing to start with. Like I said, it could save you a year. So if depending on how your timeline is, it might speed you up a lot. Weight, they are heavy. The different nurseries provide them in different lengths and sizes, but they're definitely heavy to move around at first. Usually takes a couple of people to move one mat around, especially if you're going to carry it any distance over an uneven surface such as a stream bank. But they are another useful tool in your toolbox. Here you can see the big, long, healthy roots sticking out of the bottom of the mat there. That's kind of what's going to get you your jump ahead, versus where you're coming from seed, where the roots are starting from nothing, or from plugs, which you've got 2 to 3 4-inch roots out of a healthy plant plug. So there you can see that giant head start that you're going to get out of that. And you can also see the coir mat here, which is typically a combination of the large cargo net type net there you see, and then a coir infill on the inside. Some nurseries do it with topsoil, and other nurseries do it with some other materials that are they're kind of like a wood fiber sort of. And each nursery kind of has its own growing specifications on what they provide. One of the nice things about this is you can pick, if you give them advance notice, obviously it's going to require some advance notice to get these mats grown. Give us a second here. Excuse me. It's going to get you some you're going to need some advance notice to grow these in here and to get them started. So you're going to have quite a bit of lead time. Possibly as much as a year's lead time before these will be ready for you. So they do require a little bit more pre-planning than say seed does. On super steep stream banks, we had a question here. It says, what's the best erosion control for a steep bank? Essentially the best erosion depends on what you're kind of calling steep. And one of the other things that we kind of need to consider more so than the steepness is how much water flow we're dealing with. There's a bunch of different answers to this question. You can use a combination of BMPs. We'll talk about some more of those in just a second here, but I'll answer that one as we go here. Lost it. All right, so some permanent reinforcement that we can kind of talk about. This is actually one of the great things for a steep stream bank, are vegetated soil lifts. Actually, perfect timing for this. So what these are is typically they're 6 to a foot at a time soil lift on a steep bank. And as you move up the bank, you basically are creating sort of a burrito wrap each time of a reinforced soil, basically. So you've got either a turf reinforcement mat, something like a North American Green SC250, or which is a turf reinforcement mat, which has, it's like an erosion control mat, except it has a heavier center fill usually on it. With SC250, for instance, there is a almost looks like a accordion type folded up piece of paper of plastic that runs through the middle of it that the vegetation grows through, and it's permanent. And what that does is it kind of helps that native vegetation lock itself all together through that plastic. And so you're not just working with the one root, you're working with a whole group of roots all together rather than just that one. And as you go up, you seed the fronts of each one of those lifts that you see here. You'll seed each one of these lifts as you go up. And in this instance, there's also brush layering in this one. So what that is you taking native cuttings, typically willows or dogwoods. You're dipping them in a root hormone and then putting them into in between each layer. Oftentimes these are mechanically reinforced also as well, either with say like a duckbill anchor or 12-inch landscaping staples, sometimes rebar staples, to build up and reinforce those layers as you're putting them together. So they're locked together 3, 4, 5 feet and back into the slope where you see, you know, where the fabric is wrapping over. And then those brush layers root together and further lock all of that material together. This is an option. You can also plug into the faces of the soil lifts as well, and plant plugs into the soil lift faces. One thing you want to watch doing that is you want to make sure you don't put too many holes in those so you're not losing soil out of the soil lift. Making sure that that bottom layer is really solid is super important on these, because it's basically the foundation of your slope. And then you can, when you get to the top of, say, your 8 to 10 foot tall slope, you can then have a less steep grade on the top, which can be vegetated with, you know, something like a single net straw blanket and seed. Live stakes is another option. Always want to choose native species if you're choosing woodies to go in. We typically recommend sticking with shrub type species and avoiding tree species. Although tree species provide great habitat, and especially when they tip over and those root balls are exposed into the creek, they provide a lot of riparian habitat as well that way. They're not necessarily the best option for native stabilization, basically, for stream bank stabilization. However, shrub species such as willows and dogwoods, because their stem density is so large, they typically create very nice fibrous roots underneath themselves that create really great stabilization. Typically, you're going to want to use them in a large stream corridor situation, you know, something like a forest preserve or you know, a natural river, something of the larger corridor type stuff. You're going to want to avoid them in an urban setting, just because they do kind of get big and woolly. This is one in an urban setting where they were called out, and you can see the building behind it to the right there up on the hill. And those willows actually were planted about 5 years ago, and they almost touched that building on the other side of the creek today. I actually took this picture earlier this week. So, because I went back to see kind of how they look. So you may have some need if you're putting them in an urban environment for controlling them long term, keeping them from growing into places you don't want them. So that's kind of one of the negatives. They have really high initial mortality. So if you're planning this on one of your projects, plan to lose 25 to 50% of the live stakes you put in initially. The nice thing is they're fairly cost efficient as far as when compared to other woody vegetation purchases and installation. You could use 5 gallon, 1 gallon, 5 gallon shrubs as an alternate. That would be a little bit more costly, but it's an option as well. So then we'll talk about using native vegetation with and in coordination with other BMPs. So another BMP you can use native vegetation with is this coir log here that you see running down both sides of this creek channel. You can actually both pre-order these from the nursery and have them pre-grown, or you can install them yourself inside of the coir logs by using essentially a hole drill and infilling just a little bit of soil and then planting the plugs in there. Basically they're plugged, and then the plugs are allowed to grow into the coir logs. If you're not familiar with what a coir log is, it's essentially a 6 to 9 pound per linear foot. You can get them a little bit more dense than that, but I probably wouldn't recommend more than 9 pounds because they get pretty dense after that if you're going to plant directly into them. Log made out of coconut fiber, and then they are wrapped in a net that is either made out of natural fiber like coir fiber, so additional coconut fiber is turned into rope, or they're out of a polypropylene net that is not degradable. Either way, the coir log will degrade over time, and then those plugs, which by that point will be, which it'll take 3 to 5 years minimum for the coir log to fully degrade. At which point those plugs and native species will be large enough and have reseeded enough times that they will fill in that space in the stream bank and further stabilize it. Another option would be to use them in combination with anti-scour mats, and there's a number of manufacturers that make these, and you can use that deep root structure to get even more protection out of those scour mats. This was right after this one was installed. This is a project here in Sycamore that we used these on. Rather than putting a whole bunch of stone into the creek corridor for this creek here, we used the scour mats to carry that flow down into the creek and keep it stable, so we weren't having any erosion. And these are now vegetated fully. You can't even see that the scour mats are there, and have turned out very nicely. You can use them with concrete block mats, as you see in the lower right hand corner. So you can use native vegetation through those. And what those are, if you've never seen a concrete block mat, is it kind of looks like almost a square or pyramidal type shape that is molded directly into biaxial geogrid, and then backed with an erosion control blanket on the backside, which you can put directly over the native topsoils and seed the native soils, roll the mat out, secure the mat for its initial growing period. Once it grows in, it works kind of like a turf reinforcement mat on steroids, and the native vegetation will continue to grow through, provide that habitat, provide the additional stabilization of locking the mats down to the soil surface by using those deep root profiles. You can kind of intermix those BMPs. You can see the outside bend stone toe protection in the bottom left-hand corner there. And those can actually be plugged into with native vegetation. Typically, I recommend doing that in the second year of planting's life. So give it one full growing season. And what that does is it kind of allows a little bit of sediment to build up in between those stones so that the roots actually have something to bite into and get their nutrients from and start growing in. So you're not just trying to stick them in between some rocks and hope that they survive and don't get pulled out by high flows. You'll also see there a whole bunch of different kinds of erosion control blanket. You can see right up against the shoreline and against the normal water line there of the creek that we've got a straw coconut mat, and that's one thing that will definitely help along the normal water line, is using a little bit heavier blanket in your designs, and then switching to a regular straw mat above that. And you can see in that photo that it's all BioNet blanket, which I definitely recommend anytime you're working in a creek channel, so we're not trapping any of the critters and creatures that live in and around your creek corridors. So you can see in the top left-hand picture there, another example of vegetation growing within the riprap. This is in front of a flared end section that leads to a creek here. But it's definitely another opportunity to make that riprap even more stable and stronger. If you try and go pick up even one of those stones that's in that vegetation, it's like trying to, pry a rock out of granite almost. It's or out of a brick wall. They really get rooted in there and lock down nicely. They provide additional habitat this way, for things like crayfish and snails and macroinvertebrates and some of your microinvertebrates as well. You can get your different larval states for different bugs in there growing and crawling around, and so that works out very nicely. Oh, I accidentally grabbed that picture twice. I apologize for that one. You can also use them with gabion baskets. So, and this is an opportunity and a picture of us protecting this bridge structure here for a walking path. And so over top of all of those Coil or those gabion baskets is soil lift over top of them that is planted with native vegetation. That native vegetation will work its way down into the gabion baskets. The root system will lock the tops of the gabion baskets in place and help to hold it together. There's also a tie back in that second layer that goes, about 6 foot back into the soil behind the gabion baskets. And that too, over time, will get locked in with those long roots of the native grasses as well. So just one more way you'll see them work together and really help each other out. So we've talked about, different ways we can incorporate native vegetation into it, but one of the things everybody needs to remember is that it's not a set it and forget it moment. You've got, 3 to 5 years of establishment at least, which is going to include, heavy invasive species control, hand pulling, hand cutting, herbicide application, and making sure if you're using herbicides that they are aquatic approved herbicides, so we're not poisoning our water system or polluting. Mowing, if you get a big stand of annual invasives that come up, you may need to mow those banks. If you have a big tree from an adjacent woodland fall over into your stream bank, you may need to cut it out and cut it back. Get a big heavy storm and it washes in a bunch of debris from upstream or downstream or upstream. You're going to need, some help with that and getting those materials out of there. If you have a large, an extreme event and you have unexpected erosion for some reason before the bank can get fully established, you may have to rework and replant an area. So these are some things you may want to budget for when you're planning your creek projects. You may have human activity where a car crashes into your stream bank area or something like that, tears it up, that you may have to repair as well. So they're definitely not a set it and forget it. They will require an initial maintenance period that's pretty heavy. 3 to 5 visits a year for an experienced crew is definitely pretty standard for those first 3 to 5 years. The last come on. So you'll have long-term maintenance considerations also. You're going to have, invasive species removal long-term. You're not going to just do that herbicide application or hand removal for the first 3 to 5 years. The creek will continue to wash in invasive species. Reed canary grass likes to float really well. The seeds do, and you'll have a random patch of reed canary grass pop up, or if you're trying to keep, invasive shrub species out, you'll have those washing into your areas as well, or being dropped in by local avian species. You may need to make sure you're getting enough sunlight down. So as trees that were either planted on the upstream on the banks, or as trees move in, you may need to remove or thin some of those trees out to make sure you're getting enough sunlight down to the native vegetation. You're going to have continuous maintenance going with all of these. Even after those 5 years, you're not going to be able to just walk away from it. And then, so conclusions. So native vegetation is definitely a valuable tool in our toolbox. There's a lot of different ways you can use it. Native vegetation has its limits, especially in urbanized stream systems. So you can only take them unreinforced up to a certain, flow rate, up to certain steepnesses on your banks. Reinforced, you can take them a lot further, and they can actually help, some of your hard armor BMPs be more efficient and more established and do a better job. And then, it requires long-term establishment and long-term maintenance. It's definitely not a set it and forget it. So plan for your projects to have long-term maintenance. It's not necessarily just about winning that first grant and getting the project done. You've got to continue to do the maintenance long-term, or the project will revert and go back to a failing state almost. Looks like we got another question. So what sorts of permissions and permits do you need to work on or near a stream? That's a great question. I get this one a lot in my travels around the area. Depending on what you're doing, you're going to need something as complicated as an Army Corps permit, Army Corps of Engineers permit. Local county permits happen quite frequently, I'm sorry. And then you're also going to need possibly local city village permits as well, depending on what municipality you're working in. Sometimes cities and localities don't care, and other times they're very much communities that require sign off before you can even begin work. With Army Corps of Engineers permits, you may have to have additional plan sets to show people. You may have to to submit, you may have to do a wetland delineation beforehand before you can submit to the Army Corps of Engineers to show where the stream is at essentially, and where that riparian corridor is at. Depending on what you're doing, you may need to look at where the floodplain is at, and look at FEMA maps to get that information. So there's can be quite a bit of permitting that's required. If you're doing something as simple as say removing the reed canary grass off of a bank and planting just vegetation, you may not need a permit at all. That also depends on what county you're in. Outside the collar counties, you could switch to native vegetation without any permitting whatsoever, as long as you do it in a responsible manner and aren't disturbing any soil.
There's another question, Ryan, too. What do you consider as the best hard armor materials?
That is a big question. So it's going to be multifaceted answer to really answer your question correctly. One of the things that I prefer most often is stone, as far as hard armor is concerned. One, because it does move around a little bit once it's installed. It doesn't move a lot if you've done it correctly, but it'll move around. It provides some habitat for plants and animals. And there's a few different kinds to choose from. So depending on what the aesthetics of the project are and what the budget of the project is, you can choose from different stone types to get the desired look, I guess you would say, for a project. Another hard armor that I like is gabion baskets aren't bad when they're done correctly. I see a lot of gabion projects that make me cringe when I go by them. So it's very important if you're going to do gabion baskets, you definitely get a structural engineer involved with that. If you're going higher than one level of gabion baskets high, even at one level, make sure you have a qualified contractor to install those. Same goes with doing the native vegetation. If you don't have a qualified contractor or someone that's qualified to do the design work, you're probably not going to like the end result you get. By all means, as an owner, you want to make sure you're giving some input for what you want the project to look like. At the end, if you're not being asked what you want the project to look like at the end game, then you need to probably find a different designer or a different contractor for that matter. If, as far as more hard armor stuff goes, I don't mind concrete block mats when they're done correctly. I definitely like to see them vegetated and not just filled with stone. In that case, because it really gives, that vegetation gives them a lot more anchorage. And I'm excluding, like, say, the big giant IDOT articulated mats. Those are a completely different animal. I'm talking more about the flexible mat type concrete products. What other hard armors do we use frequently? Let me think here for just a second. I will say I would definitely never recommend using concrete in a stream bank if it's avoidable at all. I don't prefer grout filled material type products. They're not my favorite thing. The freeze thaw cycle that happens here in the northern states tends to destroy any concrete that's installed or anything that's grouted. There's a few grout gabion mattress type stuff that I don't like the aesthetic appeal of it, I guess, personally. Plus it also takes any habitat options out. And if we can use vegetation and use the natural native materials, obviously those are going to be more beneficial to our native species. So we're going to get a little bit better end result for everybody involved that way.
Perfect. There is another question. Do the nurseries you work with in your area do a good job of selecting native species and not utilizing introduced species? Or do you just give them a species mix?
So we do both. So the native nurseries that I deal with, and there's probably a half dozen in the area. that we work with pretty regularly. And those nurseries definitely are using native species that are from within a 200-mile radius, say. And we ask for local ecotype plants all the time. It is very rare at this stage in the business that I have a client or customer that wants something that's not of local ecotype. So those nurseries that we deal with pretty much only supply us with local ecotype species. That being said, we do it both ways as far as telling or receiving what species we would like. Every local nursery that supplies native plants and native seed, if you go on their website and fish around a little bit, you can find their seed lists for what they kind of recommend, what to go where. Check those out and compare nursery to nursery. And by all means, use Google as a friend, and you can Google those scientific names and find out exactly what most of those species are going to look like. You can also use that fine Google machine and find on USDA's website. Typically, it's one of the top few things that comes up when you search a scientific name. That'll list where those species are best for. So if you're looking for something that'll grow in that emergent zone, you can find that on that type of resource. Or if you're looking for something that's upland, it'll tell you that as well. So that's kind of what the best scenario is. I can tell you that we give them our seed mixes where we pick the vegetation out. Sometimes I have clients that only want certain things. I recently finished a project that the client wanted green and white, and that's all they wanted on their project. And we made that work. Thankfully, there's a lot of native species that are native to Northern Illinois, and we can kind of work with that sometimes, but a lot of times we're also selecting for things like a forest equality index or a C value, where we're trying to get above a certain C value, which is the coefficient of conservatism for those that don't know. And basically that's how rare a plant is, to put it into layman's terms, essentially. And so, we might be selecting for that, or we might be trying to boost a quality of a habitat. So we might be putting in very, very conservative species. So just depends as far as what we're selecting. That goes project to project, and again, client to client.
Good. Thank you, Ryan. There is another question. It says, what native vegetation do you recommend using on top of concrete blocks with topsoil and hydroseed on top? This is a large-scale project done behind our property prior to us moving in.
Sure. So I'm guessing that means your concrete blocks are probably in already. I typically like to put the seed in underneath the concrete blocks. Most of the concrete blocks that we install are meant to be seeded underneath of. If you are infilling into those concrete blocks, so it's an option to basically take topsoil and spread it into the cracks of those existing concrete blocks. I would recommend probably doing something that's a little bit on the grass heavy side, something that's a little bit more forgiving. Those concrete blocks tend to be a little warm at times, and might change the temperature of the soil. So I'm going to probably be recommending going towards something that's going to be a little bit more hardy, not necessarily something that's going to be a super high C value, but more something that's going to give you the stabilization factor. The wild rides are pretty hardy. Virginia and Canada wild ride, depending on where you're at on the slope. Little blue stem's pretty hardy. Big blue stem gets pretty big around the root zone, so I may not pick that. You might actually end up moving some of those blocks around with big blue stem, but going that sort of route, picking hardier flowers as well. Stuff that, if you were to ask one of your nurseries, what's easy to grow, that's probably what's also the hardy stuff too. That being said, as far as for cover, hydromulch is an option. Depends on how steep the area is. You might have to go to something as high as like a bonded fiber matrix to get there. Not to rep it, but Profile Products makes a pretty good product called Flextera that you can put over top of it. You might want to try doing erosion control blanket. In a stream scenario, I prefer erosion control blanket. The reason for that being is some of the hydromulch products sometimes have a harder time holding on in a high flow scenario. And if it's got articulated concrete mat on it already, it's probably a high flow scenario. So you might want to look at an erosion control blanket, and then you're going to have to kind of wedge those staples down into those cracks. You may need to switch to a longer staple, something like a 12-inch staple, and so that you can get all the way down into that parent soil, which is probably a little bit more solid, because you're not really going to be able to compact that material between those blocks when you're installing it.
Okay, that's great to know. And as Brian said earlier in his presentation, most of this items and native plants take about 3 years before they really look good. Someone asked a question: what is best for a high flow creek and steep bank? I guess they're assuming what native plants are. I'm assuming that's what they mean for high creek flow and steep stream bank. Reinforcements.
Yeah, so in a really urbanized stream channel, so we've actually done a couple of the sections of a creek called Silver Creek, which is probably one of the most urbanized outside of the Chicago River that I've worked in. We've done a project on the Chicago River as well, doing Streambank Stabilization, but which won a couple of awards, but it's a whole different story. Boy, you're probably going to be looking at something, without seeing it, that's really hard to say. Here, I'll switch slides. If you want to tell me where you're at and where your stream's at, I can probably come out and take a look at it and get you a little better idea. With the heavily urbanized stuff that's super flashy and really, really steep, without seeing it in person and maybe having an engineer doing some modeling on it, it might be hard to make a call as to if you can even use vegetation in that situation. You may be in a scenario where you might be in a lot more stone and a lot less vegetation. If you can use vegetation, you're going to be probably looking at something that's grass heavy with a little bit of forbs in it, to get you through. If you are, if you're not in a super flashy area where the water comes up and stays up for more than 48 hours at a time, you might be able to get away with more vegetation. My experience is with those super urbanized streams, sometimes they stay up for longer than 48 hours. And the reason I say 48 hours is so if you put a plant underwater for a whole lot longer than 48 hours, more than a couple of times in a year, in an established plant, a brand new one, if you do it more than twice on 48 hours, you'll probably kill it. But if you can get them established, if it's happening more than a few times a year, you're probably going to drown those plants out. They can't respire underwater, obviously. Plants that are terrestrial in nature and not emergent plants. Even emergent plants, if you put them all the way underwater for longer than 48 to 72 hours, you can kill them. So the nice thing about them oftentimes with the emergent plants is they already have an established emergent plant, I should say, is they have enough of a root structure that they'll resprout, come back up. So it's something to think about if you've have lived on that creek or have dealt with that creek for a long time. You might want to be, and you've seen that where it's come up where you see the water stay up for 72 hours or more. Where when I say it's coming up, like I'm saying it's coming up 6-8 feet vertically. You may want to start thinking about something other than vegetation for your stabilization.
That's great
But
advice. Yeah.
as much as I hate to say that, much as I like putting plants in the ground.
Yeah, and there are those situations that you just can't help that, and that's great advice. So I don't see any more questions. We're coming up on 2 o'clock. I want to say thank you, Ryan. You did a great job. And if you have questions, there's Ryan's contact information. You can email him if you want him to come look at your site if you have an issue. And like he said, be sure to get your permits. And DuPage County Stormwater Management is really great to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And Ryan can help you too. And be sure to call them before you start any work in the Streambank area for the necessary permits. Just want to emphasize that. So thank you, Ryan. Everyone have a great day. And this will be recorded. We will be sending out the recording to everyone that is registered for the webinar. So thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you, Ryan. Bye-bye.